Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Dawn Van Dam, and I'm the president of 1 Million Solutions in Health. Today we have a very interesting presentation on the genetics of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So let me introduce a little bit about the presentation and give you a bit of background about our organization, and then we'll kick things off. So at 1 Million Solutions in Health, our goal is to improve healthcare one solution at a time. And we focus on doing that through new ideas and new information in the life sciences area, in healthcare, and for patients and consumers. So we're very excited to be bringing you this informative and interesting webinar today that we can share with everyone. How we do this in 1 Million Solutions in Health is we create opportunities to connect with others who are working on initiatives around the globe to improve healthcare, looking at accelerating life sciences research and sharing patient and consumer-focused ideas and solutions. We also really try to encourage people to learn and share, and we do that through events such as this, live events as well, discussion forums, articles, blogs, all those sorts of things. And we also try to help people innovate by having them send us their ideas, whether you be in academia, in the government, if you're an entrepreneur, or if you're in a great big business, we don't care. We just want to help share your ideas around the world. So that's a little bit more about us and what we do. So I'm going to give you some background information about today's talk and then introduce our speaker. So today's talk, as I mentioned, is all about Alzheimer's disease and the genetics of it. And I'm just going to pull up real quick here the summary of it. Here we go. So as the population ages, we have increasing cases of dementia, especially Alzheimer's type, which are fundamentally uncovered and undiagnosed, or need to be uncovered and diagnosed, sorry. The genetics of these conditions are rapidly being elucidated and have been of interest to the scientific community and the lay public alike for a long time. Genetic tests can suggest a higher degree of likelihood for patients to develop such conditions, which, contrary to popular thought, is of value to patients in their normal routine of healthcare and preventative medicine if they can know more about their current genetic status. This webinar will focus on the complex genetics that seem to make us prone to such conditions as we age. So let me give you a little bit of background about our speaker, Dr. Arnold Palais. He has been working in this field for quite a long time and is really quite an expert in this area. So let me just grab his bio and we'll go from there. So here we go. Dr. Palais is the founder and associate director of personalized genomic medicine at Atlantic Health System, located at Morristown and Overlook Medical Centers in New Jersey. He practices, lectures, and champions issues in genetics for physicians and patients alike. He is exposed nationally on topics in genetics and primary care and teaches genetics for medical board review courses. Dr. Palais is a board-certified family physician and has been in private practice in Montville, New Jersey since 1986. He is a founder and medical director for Vanguard Medical Group, a regional primary care practice, notable both locally and nationally as a leader in patient-centered medical homes. He is the medical director at several area nursing homes and schools. He has also served as president of the Morris County Medical Society of the New Jersey Academy of Family Physicians and is a senior delegate to the Congress of Delegates from New Jersey to AAFP. Dr. Palais graduated from the Accelerated Medical Program at Boston University, completing both his undergraduate major in history and his medical school studies there. He then finished his residency as chief resident in family medicine at UMD New Jersey, the Mountainside Hospital. He holds clinical academic appointments as associate clinical professor at both New Jersey Medical Schools and the Seton Hall Graduate School of Medicine. Dr. Palais has a long-standing interest in genetics in primary care, technology applications in medicine, and healthcare reform. He speaks extensively in all media circuits on these and other issues to both public and peer audiences. He also was the national medical spokesperson for the Paid Vacation Act of 2009 in Congress, seeking to mandate appropriate paid time off for employees of large corporations. So I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Pale today because I also have known him directly and personally, and I know he's doing fabulous work in this area. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Dr. Pale and also have him speak to you about this interesting topic. While he's getting ready for that, and what you just have to do, Dr. Pale, is unmute yourself to the right of your name. I just want to remind everyone that we would love it if you could put some questions for us into the chat box, which is to the right of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also have a short survey where we're going to be collecting your feedback and getting your ideas for future webinars. So please, as we're going along, put in any questions that you have, and then when Dr. Pale is finished, I will ask him those questions and we'll get his thoughts on what you'd like to learn more about. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arnold Pale.
Thank you, Dawn. Good morning, everybody. And again, thanks for having me with you on the webinar today. This is really an exciting, very topical discussion. I'm sure many people, if they look at the news, there's been a number of research protocols that have been in the lay press, and I'll try to speak about that briefly in this morning's discussion. So I look to always just start my conversation with genetics involving primary care, in this case dementia and Alzheimer's, by taking a minute to discuss what Hippocrates said. It is more important to know what sort of a person has the disease than to know what sort of a disease a person has. And I like that statement because it really points it in the direction of personalized medicine, something that we now even use the terminology of precision medicine, which is really attempting to tailor individual treatments for individual patients. And more recently now, by adding testing in genomics, which encompasses genes and protein products. Really what it is tries to point us in the exact direction for patients' health care. So personalized medicine, again, well, current practice, to the chagrin of some of my peers in healthcare, tends in many cases to be trial and error, and in many cases we try therapies, hope it works, and in some cases it does, some cases it doesn't. And while I'm not taking anything away from that, what we try to work with in personalized medicine is really the right treatment for the right person at the right time, really laser focusing therapy for an individual patient. What's fascinating, and I have a history background, is when you look at personalized medicine, it really is the outgrowth of the Human Genome Project. The sequencing was completed about 13, 14 years ago at a cost of almost $3 billion, which is almost akin to the space program. A lot of money, a lot of resources spent with a lot of important dividends. I call the Human Genome Project which was an important undertaking by the federal government and private industry working together in tandem, that they have now spawned off the personalized medicine products that I'll be talking about some things today and other care aspects of medicine as well. Let me take a minute to start off because everyone's not on the same page, and I'm not here to make anyone on this phone call geneticist, but basically genetics tends to be the things we all know in the past. You know, Mendelian pea plants that we've been studying for a number of years now, more commonly the rare, unusual genetics that most of us have grown up with. Genomics is now more all-encompassing, including both genes with their interactions with the environment as well. So things like heart disease, asthma, and things such as dementia and Alzheimer's have both a genetic and a genomic basis. So genetics would be like microeconomics, genomics would be like macroeconomics of sorts. And again, like I said before, you use the DNA helix, and when you're walking up, it's sort of like one small step for man, which is like the way we have more or less undertaken using space program for a lot of improvements in society. Well, the same thing with genetics. Again, not to make anyone this phone call webinar geneticist, but you need to have a 1-second background that there are DNA molecules or base pairs, and they're listed below: adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, and these pair together to form the DNA molecules, which are really the backbone of our whole human body and how we function. Now, SNPs are something some people in this world hear about, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms, and I only mention that for a second because a lot of the research initially in areas such as Alzheimer's and dementias has included looking at biomathematical modeling, where we look at slight changes, and it could be even seen in this that there's a slight change in one base pair. It can make a difference, and if you look at millions of them and using a computer to analyze them, we can try to stratify who has commonality of abnormalities in their genes and who therefore may be more likely to develop certain conditions. This is one of the ways we're using genes to help us have predictive modeling who might have a condition, again, in this case, such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So again, personalized medicine really interacts across a host of areas of medicine: cardiology, oncology, pediatrics, OB, maternal fetal medicine, which many of us know about, now drug sensitivities. There's a lot of ethical issues, but again, I'm going to steer this focus of this conversation directly into Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions as well. One other comment that I find important when we're discussing this, genomics and you. Genomics will be to the 21st century what infectious disease was to the 20th century. It should be considered in every facet of public health, things like infectious disease, occupational health, environmental, and certainly what most of us know, that maternal and child health. That's been well understood. When a woman were to get pregnant, there are always needs to do certain testing to see what risk that child may have. Well, that has not changed. In fact, that has expanded tremendously. But now, in addition, we can use the areas of genomics in the adult population to look at who might be at risk of having heart disease, cancer conditions, or neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Now, the first person who had their full human genome sequencing was the gentleman in this picture. That would be Dr. Watson, famous for DNA elucidation, Watson and Crick. And in this photograph, he's looking at his full sequencing. And I have it up there for a reason, because it was about $2 million to get his full sequencing. Today, that cost has dropped quite precipitously in the range of a few $1,000s, approaching the point of being utilized in day-to-day medical practice by people's personal physicians, and that will be quite important when that happens in the very, very near future. But the slide is up for another reason, because it turns out that indeed Dr. Watson looked for information about his full sequencing, but he chose not to look at his risk of Alzheimer's disease based upon that because of his knowledge of his family history. And while he's representative of a small subset of the population, I will show you in later presentations several slides that document that a high percentage of people in the general population, in fact, do want to know what their risk based upon genetics of having Alzheimer's disease or other dementia conditions, and I'll explain the whys, wheres, and the basis of that as well. It's important to talk about pedigree. We as geneticists spend a lot of our effort taking 3 generational family histories, and the key point that I want to get across with this is that when families talk to me in my office about genetics, it's not important to know just who may or may have not had a condition, but at what age they were diagnosed with that condition, and as much detail as is obtainable around the Thanksgiving table or during the holidays when you see your grandparents or uncles or aunts, because that information can be used by genetic counselors and physicians practicing genetics to have a more precise recommendation for what, if any, genetic testing could be helpful for that individual. So I kind of break up genetic testing into 2 buckets: predictive gene testing, which can be used to determine who's at risk of developing a common disease. This will include pharmacogenetic testing nowadays, which will identify variations of medications and response of patients to medications, versus focused genetic testing, which is what most of us are familiar with, things like BRCA testing, looking for breast cancer, or Fragile X, and muscular dystrophy testing as well. And the area of Alzheimer's sort of crosses into both areas, but the biggest area that is really, I think, becoming of value to the lay population would be discussions in regards to predictive gene testing. Now, what we have is I like to identify as a perfect storm, and the slide's a little complicated, but I'll try to make simple sense out of it. A lot of doctors would like to use genetic testing more and more in their practice, but only a small minority, perhaps 40%, are quite frankly comfortable in the usage of genetic testing day to day in their practices. So that's one of the issues we have to deal with. In the meantime, we have more and more genetic tests being released every day. Less and less can often be paid for, although that is changing. And so as we speak, I do find that more and more insurance companies are willing to allow reimbursement for genetic testing when proper and appropriate. And a lot of you patients, people on this phone call, 8 of 10, are very interested in genetic testing. So we need to balance these few areas, hopefully more and more to have physicians in the general community as well as genetic specialists and neurologists working on Alzheimer's to know more about genetics, but by the same time trying to get the insurance industry, when appropriate, when there's proper family history or other concerns, to get insurance coverage for these conditions. Well, it's tough to make predictions about, especially about the future, is a famous Yogi Berra, yogiism, and it is tough, but we're going to try to help you through that and understand more about that in this conversation. So what is dementia? Dementia really is a set of symptoms, including language difficulty, loss of recent memory, or poor judgment. It can be due to many disease states. There could be things called vascular dementia, or Parkinson's disease, or frontal temporal dementia, vitamin deficiency, and anyway, moving on down the line, most particularly Alzheimer's disease. And I want to be sure this is not a conversation all about what is Alzheimer's disease, although I'll mention a few more words about it, but a lot of people in the lay population attribute anything with memory loss to being due to things from Alzheimer's disease, when in fact it is not always the case. There is a lot of complexity in the world of dementia that we as physicians need to handle. Now, the consequences or results of dementia, of course, can be devastating. As America ages, we'll be faced with an unprecedented number of patients with dementia, and we are seeing that right now. An estimated 5.4 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease. By 2050, it may reach 1 million people a year with the diagnosis, or 11 to 16 million people. That's a lot of people. This is a real important healthcare issue. The cost of dementia in 2010 was estimated, and it's hard to estimate that kind of a condition, from 150 to $200 billion. So it is a devastating condition, not only for, of course, families, for loved ones, but certainly is also important when we talk about societal risks and concerns. How do we handle leaders of companies who may have Alzheimer's disease or dementia? Those who watch the show 24, which I enjoy, recent episode, we had the president resigning from the presidency because of a diagnosis of dementia, possible Alzheimer's disease. While that's a fictional TV show, certainly we've lived through that knowledge that President Reagan, in his post-presidency, certainly had issues related to dementia and Alzheimer's, and to what extent is that relevant in our leadership, both in governance and in day-to-day functions. So it's a big issue. Now, there's really no cure for Alzheimer's, but there are a few medications that have been shown that can slow the symptoms. Medications such as Aricept increase the amount of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain. Namenda, another medication, protects brain cells from a chemical called glutamate, which can damage nerve cells. And again, I don't represent any of these companies, but suffice it to say that there are medications that might be available. And one of the key discussions we as physicians need to know is, at what point do we institute therapy? And probably the earlier the better is probably appropriate. So how can we determine who may have Alzheimer's disease on an earlier basis? And needless to say, genetics may be an answer for that. Now, doctors may also give the Alzheimer's patients antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicines as well to ease their symptoms. So Alzheimer's disease is a degenerative disease of the brain. It causes dementia, gradual memory loss, judgment, and ability of function. It's usually in patients older than 65 years old. They eventually have the inability to eat, to dress, and handle personal care. It can lead to personality changes, behavioral changes, and social interaction problems as well. There can be agitation, restlessness, withdrawal, and loss of language. And on the right there, I have a photograph that shows the normal neuron and then an Alzheimer's with these plaques and these neurofibrillary tangles. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, that are relevant to the discussion of Alzheimer's disease. So the definition includes preclinical Alzheimer's disease, where there are measurable changes in biomarkers but no outward symptoms. That's mostly for research. Mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's, where there are mild changes in memory and thinking abilities that do not compromise day-to-day activities. And this is really the sweet spot that we in the field of Alzheimer's and in genetics need to try to have more and more information being made available to families and loved ones with individuals so affected. Dementia due to Alzheimer's, where memory, thinking, and behavioral symptoms that impair function starts to progress and become more of a problem as time moves on. So Alzheimer's natural course, typically 8 to 10 years after the onset of symptoms, but can be in a 1 to 25-year range. And that's one of the difficulties with this condition, that is such a wide variety. There's almost a spectrum of individuals with Alzheimer's disease. Death is often associated from pneumonia, malnutrition, or general body wasting. Now, let's move directly into what I call late onset disease, or LOD, versus early onset disease, which is much less common than late onset disease. Less than 5% of individuals with Alzheimer's have early onset disease. It's almost a different disease. There's been a lot of study, and I don't want to belabor the slide too long. I think people who are reviewing this webinar can more closely look at this at their leisure. But a number of featured studies, the systolic blood pressure intervention trial, SPRINT, the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network trial, and then the anti-amyloid treatment in asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease are three key studies that are looking at theories of the cause, theories of genetics on the basis of what is progressing in this condition. And there's a good deal of money, as I said in the beginning of this webinar, being spent as it needs to be to try to find who has the condition, who to study, and who are the people who are at risk, because that could be a real big public health impact if we can identify these people and have whatever intervention early that may be. So gene studies, one of the key studies is the Consortium for Alzheimer's Sequence Analysis, or CASA, and it's a 5-university collaboration that has recently received $12.6 million, and certainly I think there's other monies that have been headed in this direction, and it's been granted to analyze whole exomes, whole genome sequencing data from volunteers with Alzheimer's disease, as well as older populations as well. And so we're really trying to look at who are the populations and who are the individuals that are more likely to have this debilitating condition. Now, they will also study data from large families, a portion of whom are of Caribbean and Hispanic descent, that include multiple members with Alzheimer's disease. So again, a lot of this, as I stated earlier, is using a great deal of research, epidemiologic data, and mathematical modeling, where we put a lot of this data into computers that have mainframe functionality and try to look at patterns that can help us determine who may have what gene, what conditions that may be lending them more likely to have Alzheimer's disease. Now, the nature of these studies are really looking into activity between the National Institute on Aging and the National Genomic Research Institute, both are part of NIH. And there's been a lot of research looking at a number of these individual genomes, or those protein molecules I talked about earlier in our discussion. They've again taken a number of volunteers, and they've compared, and they're trying to come up with data that is forthcoming to tell us who, based on those population studies, and what genes are more likely to eventually have the diagnosis of a progressive Alzheimer's disease condition. Now, a little side kick here, Klotho, K-L-O-T-H-O, is possibly a longevity gene, and a variant of that may have improved brain skills, such as thinking, learning, and memory, regardless of their age, sex, whether they have a genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease. So something like increasing Klotho gene levels in mice, for example, seem to make them smarter, and we are trying to see if the application of longevity genes in individuals may have impact relevant to both how long an individual lives and how they keep their general brain function, which of course is the hallmark of the loss of people with Alzheimer's disease, because again, if we can determine the positive in those individuals, it might be able to be utilized to determine what negatives occur with individuals with Alzheimer's disease. Again, theories of the causes of Alzheimer's. One hypothesis about Alzheimer's disease, and I can tell you I've been learning about this since my days when I was at Boston University School of Medicine, which is one of the world headquarters of amyloid research for a long time, and that goes back 25, 30 years ago. Well, there are a lot of studies genetically that link familial forms of disease to mutations in amyloid precursor protein, or APP, and the larger protein form, which relates to plaque formation. And many people who have knowledge about Alzheimer's disease know that there seem to be the findings of certain plaque formations in the brain that correlates to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, the problem is that you can't make that diagnosis really without any certainty unless you do a brain biopsy, which of course is done on autopsy as a post-mortem event. We are trying to use imaging studies, which I'll talk about in a moment, that help to look for that in the living individual, but that is still not at final stages. So here's a brain section, a cross-section, and here's normal brain function language on the left side, and on the right side that seems to be relatively preserved, but memory, look at the difference on the left side versus the right side, a huge difference for Alzheimer's patients. Again, the pathophysiology relates to these neurofibrillary tangles, which are shown in blue in the diagram on the right, and these amyloid plaques that are spread throughout the brain. Now, memory loss is not always Alzheimer's disease, so it's really important that people on this webinar understand that conditions that may cause memory loss or dementia will include conditions such as medication side effects, chronic alcoholism, tumors or infections of the brain, blood clots in the brain, vitamin B12 deficiency, thyroid, kidney, other liver disorders. So hence the reason that you go to your family physician or internist and or your neurologist, a number of tests should be run to exclude, since in many cases Alzheimer's disease will be a disease of exclusion. If you don't find these other conditions, and if it shows certain patterns, then the diagnosis of Alzheimer's can usually be established. We are still not at the point where there's a specific focused biochemical and or genetic test for the condition of Alzheimer's disease, but certainly there are certain genetic tests which, if found to be positive, make the constellation of symptoms and findings in the human being associated with genetic findings make the diagnosis more and more probable. So this little slide for a little break for a second is the genetics landscape. Well, I've traveled with my family out to Joshua Tree National Park in California, and those who have not been there will find it is a beautiful place to go hiking, and the rolling stones around there have a peculiar similarity, I felt, to DNA molecules. I felt like I was in a DNA matrix, just kind of a fun place to go, and a little digression from the complexities of Alzheimer's disease genetics. Hope everyone's staying with me, and I'll move right along in our conversation. So Alzheimer's genetics and epidemiology, it affects 2.4 to 4.5 million Americans. It has an increasing incidence due to the aging population and longevity of patients. Now, there are familial varieties, most commonly, like I said, early onset, which tend to be associated with chromosome number 21 and 14. A PET scan is something that can often document amyloid deposits in the brain, which may have some correlation with Alzheimer's disease, but really I don't think the general population of physicians, particularly neurologists who are involved heavily in Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, suggest that a PET scan is recommended for every individual because it is not necessarily going to be correlated directly with the extent of disease or the onset of disease. It's just one other piece of information that can be helpful. Now, LOAD, or late onset, is genetic, environmental, and lifestyle related, typically, as I said, over age 60. And the diagram here, I just have autosomal dominant inheritance is commonplace, where you look at mom and dad, and if the father, in this case, has a defective copy of the gene, then two of the children here will may be similarly affected. And so we think that there may be some of this going on relevant to Alzheimer's disease, but the genetics is not so direct. So I don't want anyone to step away from this conversation thinking that, you know, if your dad is Alzheimer's, you definitely would, or you necessarily have a 50% chance. It just is a higher probability, and certainly some genetic testing, which I'm about to recommend or talk about now, could be part of that process. So as I stated earlier, these three, amyloid precursor protein, presenilin 1 or 2, are relatively rare but associated with early onset disease, Alzheimer's disease, before age 60. It's most helpful when you have more than 3 first-degree relatives affected, and in those cases, perhaps 40 to 80% may be identified in those individuals. So again, that's almost a different disease. Early onset Alzheimer's disease, as opposed to that which is much more typically seen amongst your friends and family, which is usual late onset disease, which is much more sporadic. However, when you have normal 10 to 12% of the population, when you have a first-degree relative, it goes up from 15 to 39%. Now, if they have a test called ApoE4, which is on chromosome number 19, which is present, if one of those genes is present in the individual, they have 2 to 3 times the risk. If they have 2 genes, they have 2 to 10 times the risk. So it doesn't say you will have it. It says that you are much more probable if you have the ApoE4 gene in the individuals so tested. It may hasten the development of Alzheimer's disease more than the increase in total lifetime risk. Now, there's another ApoE, the E2 allele, which may in fact decrease the risk of Alzheimer's disease. However, that is often associated with lipid problems, cholesterol-based problems, and things like macular degeneration. So the ApoE gene is becoming more and more a focus of research and clinical utilization these days. But again, it's not a diagnostic test. It's a risk stratification test, which in English means that it can help us point people in the direction if they are either thinking they may be affected or if they're concerned their parent may be heading down that direction. So there's a lot on this slide. It's a lot to talk about, but suffice it to say, as I said, chromosome number 19, the ApoE4 gene, has become a really, really important area of research. More and more laboratories can test for that, not just specialized genetic labs, but even typical labs like LabCorp Quest can do ApoE4 testing for appropriate individuals. Again, I'm not recommending we screen the general population, but if people have concerns, it can be tested for in the individuals and can give us a suggestion of who might be more likely at somewhere down the line to contract particularly late onset Alzheimer's condition. Now, the early onset, as I said, occurs in people aged 30 to 60. It's relatively rare, less than 5% of the population who have Alzheimer's. Some cases of early onset have no known cause, but most cases are inherited. So if you look at that family pedigree chart I mentioned earlier, you'll probably find someone else, more than one or two other people who might have a familial memory loss problem. Now, it's caused by any one or a number of different single gene mutations on chromosomes, as I said, 21, 14, and number 1 as well. Each of these mutations can cause abnormal proteins to be formed. The mutations on chromosome 21 will cause the amyloid precursor protein I stated earlier. A mutation on chromosome 14 relates to the presenilin 1 to be made, and mutation on chromosome number 1 leads to abnormal presenilin number 2. So again, this is a condition that, while it's rare, we seem to have a more direct genetic basis for this, and it can be carefully looked at, particularly when you look at population studies within a single family and across large epigenetic populations as well. Now, the late onset, as I said, tends to be after age 60, even after age 65. This we feel strongly is more genomic. What I say is a combination of genetic, environmental, and lifestyle factors. So this is almost a different condition in some ways, and this is typically on chromosome 19, the ApoE gene we talked about, and there are 3 types of ApoEs, which are listed below here, but the one we talk about most commonly, ApoE4. Now, there's a phosphorylated tau protein that has some importance as well. Mutations in the tau gene tends to be related to familial frontotemporal dementia, which often associates with Parkinsonism, related to chromosome number 17, and it is often strongly associated with a few other neurodegenerative conditions. But to a lesser extent, Alzheimer's disease may also be associated with this chromosome 17 abnormality related to the tau gene. So we are more and more having research that's looking into this Taoism or tau gene that may relate to a genetic basis for late onset Alzheimer's disease, but that's not really as relevant in terms of day-to-day clinical function at the present time. And here's a little drawing that sort of discusses the chromosome and how the DNA may play a role in turning genes off or on, which may have a strong relationship to the development of Alzheimer's disease. Other genes that we're looking into that may relate to this condition are listed here: SRL1, CLU, CR1, PICALM, and TREM2. And again, I don't want to get to too detailed a conversation because this is really not being utilized much day to day by clinicians in the real world in terms of screening for patients right now. But these are genes that may have association with Alzheimer's disease that I think with the amount of study, research, money's being poured into this type of area of research, we may in the near future find that people can have an Alzheimer's disease panel. In fact, certain companies, I can mention Athena Genetics is one, Mayo as well, have Alzheimer's gene panels that in the right population with the right family history, pedigree, and the right constellation of clinical findings, in rare cases, we in the world of genetics and neurologists will order this type of testing if we have uncertainty or families have interest in trying to know if that individual is likely to either have Alzheimer's disease now or is moving along in that particular direction. And so I do predict that is not far from individuals who are either at high risk or high concern that they will have genetic testing to help them to elucidate probability and risk factors for this. You know, it's interesting to note that this type of conversation scares people, and I understand why it would. And it's got some people thinking, well, I don't really want to know about having a condition like Alzheimer's that there's not a lot you can do about. And I answer a few different ways. So first and foremost, there isn't nothing you can do about it because there are certain theories of better lifestyle management, weight loss, conditions like better exercise, certainly the institution at an earlier juncture for medications that may have effects at slowing down or even reversing Alzheimer's disease, if that ever comes to fruition, becomes important. And I mentioned there are medications that are on the market that probably, if used earlier, more appropriately, might have some degree of not preventing Alzheimer's disease, but certainly slowing the pace. And any family members who might be on this call or have had family members with Alzheimer's know the humongous cost to that individual in terms of stress and family dynamics associated with the diagnosis. So if you can have mom or dad have 2, 3, or 5, or 7 better years before they're having the horrible long-term sequelae of having Alzheimer's disease, that is a really, really positive thing that can be done for them. But what I also want to mention is that a lot of individuals have their cholesterol measured. Cholesterol is a biochemical marker that has value. Certainly no one would disagree of who is likely to have heart disease. And while I would differentiate the fact that if you had cholesterol markers and they were highly abnormal, you could institute medications, diet, lifestyle modifications that might, it just might, delay or prevent the onset of a catastrophic heart event. I think some of that is applicable as well for the Alzheimer's condition, with the slight difference that there is not as much you can do about Alzheimer's, but that's not to say there's nothing you can be done. So what I'm saying in English is that if you want to know your cholesterol and you're 35 years old and you're concerned because long-term you're worried about having heart disease, is not so far off wanting to know potentially more about Alzheimer's disease genetics. Now let's talk more about imaging studies. I mentioned CT, computerized tomography, body scans, MRIs. These are of value, but they're not specific. They are better associated with stroke and brain atrophy, things like that over here, but they don't necessarily diagnose this condition of having Alzheimer's disease, but they can rule out associated conditions as well. Now, the amyloid beta peptides and the tau proteins I mentioned before are less commonly utilized. They can be used in cerebrospinal fluid. If someone has a spinal tap, they can measure those, and that could be valuable in certain individuals to establish the presence of tangles, plaques, et cetera, that are so strongly associated, as I said earlier, with dementia of Alzheimer's type. The ApoE gene, I mentioned about that already. The presenilin, types 1 and 2, and amyloid precursor protein I mentioned as well. So again, this chart looks at certain tests to help to categorize dementia because, again, it's a complicated area for we as clinicians and for family members to know about and understand. So I want to finish up discussing the REVEAL study, which a friend of mine, Bob Green, who works out of my alma mater, Boston University, and now is at Harvard. He's a neurologist who's become a geneticist, and he has done seminal research on the disclosure of the ApoE genotype for the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And the reason I bring this up now is going to the whole conversation, do people want to know? Do people actually want to be aware of whether or not they have the ApoE gene and consequently a high risk of Alzheimer's disease? And while this was a small study, this was front page in the New England Journal of Medicine about 2 years ago, where they had 111 subjects with a parent with Alzheimer's disease and tested the ApoE gene. And 53 of them, these patients, carried at least one copy of the gene. So as you remember, that means they are anywhere from 2 to 10% at higher risk, 2 to 10 times higher risk, I should say, of Alzheimer's disease from the general population. What they found, surprising to many in the physicians community is that there was no significant difference between the groups in terms of anxiety, depression, or tests related to stress. What I mean to say is that many of patients, peers, people on this phone call, et cetera, find they do want to know what their risk of Alzheimer's disease, and they want to know because they want to be aware and they want to take any action they may or may not be able to in that regards. So the general thought people may think, oh, nobody wants to know about that, has not always been borne out both in research and, in fact, when a number of direct-to-consumer companies were offering Alzheimer's disease SNP testing as part of their direct-to-consumer panels, many of whom are being restricted by the FDA at the present time, but companies like 23andMe and Navigenics and Decode, et cetera, that have been on the market going directly to the consumer, well, many of them would have a specialty function on their results where a person had to just click off a disclaimer that I would like to know about my risk of Alzheimer's disease, and it's not like nobody actually clicked that. In fact, the commonality of a number of people would want to know that. Of course, people who get genetic testing might be, of course, more inclined to want to know their genetics from both cardiac, oncology, other standpoint, but also might be more likely to want to know their genetics based upon dementia of Alzheimer's. But what I submit to listeners is that there's more interest and more commonality to know about such conditions than may be readily apparent. That's not to say that I believe, as a geneticist, that all people should have this test. What I believe it should be available to those who want to know, and there is probably some value in doing that. Now, this is entirely different than having conditions like Huntington's disease or ALS, which is commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease, where there is nothing you can do about the condition, number one, but more importantly, if you have the gene for either of those conditions, you will, without any doubt, have that diagnosis in your lifetime. So that's a little bit different than, like I said, the cholesterol biomarker for possibility of heart disease, and even the ApoE or others that suggest a higher probability but do not mean it's definitive that you will one day have Alzheimer's disease. So we have a whole program that we've established at the Atlantic Health System that looks into this whole area of risk stratification for people who have gene conditions and those who may be at risk down the line. And again, we use more and more the word precision medicine nowadays, and it's important. The Surgeon General has a site, hhs.gov, family history, where it's very useful for families to go in and they can put their family history in that site and bring that to their personal physician to help them whether they're at risk of any kind of problem. Our program is the Jacobs Levy Equity Management Personalized Genomic Medicine Program here in North New Jersey, and we really try to help people, if they choose, based on their own decision, to find information about these conditions and to help them with the newest research to know if it's important for them. Again, we don't force this on anybody. We think it's valuable to those who want to know more about it. So right now, day to day, genes are becoming more and more a piece of what can be important for the practice of medicine. It's no longer just taking family history, getting, let's say, an EKG, a CBC, a breathing test, maybe a chest X-ray. Well, now, in the right populations, as I've shown throughout this discussion this morning, I think that genetic testing is a big piece of what can be considered, especially in the population of individuals with significant memory loss, significant conditions of poor functioning as they age, who can just be termed, it's a colloquialism, oh, mom or dad has Alzheimer's disease. Well, do they have it? Maybe they don't. And maybe you need to do certain testing, as I showed earlier in the slide presentation, ruling out other conditions. And in some individuals, the genetic testing may really point us in a more focused, laser-like fashion to who has a certain diagnosis and who would be specifically more likely to have the disease of early onset Alzheimer's disease or late onset disease. And if that person has that, do we have institution of earlier interventions with medications and other support groups and other diet lifestyle modifications? And then the real clinker, do we consider testing the offspring, the children of such affected individuals? And again, making that available to me probably makes sense, and whether an individual chooses to do that testing and at what point they choose to do that, that's a whole nother discussion. That's a whole bioethical discussion, which we can always have. But I can just tell you that I think that's a disclaimer that some people want to know, some people don't want to know, and we as the medical community need to let people make that choice so they can choose if they find that information important in how they conduct their life. So I hope this was a helpful presentation for those who are on here, and we can open up any questions about the conditions of genetics based on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. I thank you for those who've been attending this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pale. You've done a fabulous job of also giving us the perspective on, where things fit in research, where things fit in the area of treatment, and also some of the new advances that are going forward. So I would encourage everyone to put any questions into the chat box, and I'll start with this first question here. Isn't it kind of expensive or almost too expensive to have genetic testing done these days?
Well, that's fascinating that you asked that, Dawn, because as a matter of fact, I did put this slide in not just to have fun with talking about Dr. James Watson, who's obviously a Nobel Prize-winning researcher, but the fact is that we have really dropped precipitously in the cost of doing genetic testing and its application. In fact, there's a coined word, the $1,000 genome, and more that's what's going to be out there, that people are going to find the costs much more reasonable. I can tell you that ApoE testing is not all that expensive. It depends on lab to lab. It's often covered by insurance. As an example, the APP, presenilin 1 and 2, are not as readily covered, but I am offered to obtain insurance reimbursement for the right individuals when appropriate. But to get back to your basic question is, in terms of genetic testing, I always liken it to an iPad. That's my little fun presentation when I speak to populations. An iPad probably would have cost, 30 years ago, $1 million. The complexity of putting all that computer technology into a little small glass, 8 by 6 little container would have been crazy and almost unthinkable. Today it costs $500, which is not cheap, but it is affordable more and more by the general population. So iPads are used by enormous numbers of people around the world, around the globe. Well, genetic testing at $2 million is like that iPad, and today being available in the range of anywhere from $100 for certain testing up to, let's say, $7,000 for full sequencing is making it much more affordable to the general population and not just for the affluent patients. And so a lot of testing we can achieve in a genomic center that we have, for example, Atlantic Health, can be readily affordable by either insurance reimbursement or in many cases by individuals when it's a few $100s, let's say, and it's a single test. You don't do it 5 times, unlike repeating cholesterol, CBCs, EKGs, and the information so derived can make, in many cases, a huge impact on how one conducts one's health care, both as a patient and working with their own personal physician. Hope that helps, Dawn.
Great. Oh, thank you. So I know you mentioned the full genetic testing, and that would be more like a $7,000 price. But for the particular area that we're talking about here, the Alzheimer's testing, what's more of an average price for that today?
Well, the ApoE, as I said, I don't know the latest number, but it's like hundreds of dollars at the most, I believe. It's often covered by panels from regular insurers, and there are Alzheimer's disease panels by some of the major neurogenetic testing companies out there, and I don't know the exact cost because it's so fluctuating, but the reality is it's not in a price range that I haven't had many patients who felt the proper need and the appropriate need to either have us get the test and get the insurer to cover it, write letters to get that covered, or in many cases, individuals with a strong pedigree, family history saying, look, doc, I need this information. We think it's important for our family to know this, so we're going to get the test done. So I wish I knew the exact numbers. I'm sorry I don't have them at my fingertips, but it's not a number that is widely different than getting a CAT scan, MRI, or other such tests when appropriate for individuals. It's not at all in the $1 million, 100,000, or tens of thousands. It's really come down in a much more reasonable range. And of course, I wish it was, $50, and that may happen in the future. But it's not a number that I've seen precluding patients who are interested in getting the test from not getting it, Dawn.
Great. Okay, thanks. That's terrific. Yeah, I know for me personally, I've both tried out the 23andMe test back a couple years ago, and then also some other genetic testing. And yeah, I just wanted to make sure people knew that it wasn't a $7,000 price, and it's much more affordable than it was a long time ago. So that's great. Thank you.
In addition, I should point out that a lot of the companies do genetic tests. They need to accumulate data, so more and more in the early stages, they'll do testing, and they're not going to balance bill or pursue reimbursement as heavily because they need to get the database filled. They need patients so they can prove their studies with the physician community. So again, sometimes testing gets done, they submit to insurance, and they don't always get paid in full. And that's how it happens sometimes when you're in the cutting edge of research. I'm sorry, Dawn, go ahead. Another question?
No, that's great. That's really, really helpful. That's excellent. Thank you. Another question here is, can genetic testing make a difference for patients with memory disorders? So maybe we don't know yet what the diagnosis is or other things.
Okay, that's a very important question. So I think the reality is, as I hopefully laid out during this presentation, I don't consider genetic testing to be truly a part of the direct conversation of an individual who is 74 years old in front of me at this minute when I'm going to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, institute therapy, and try to move forward with their care with their providers. That individual already has some condition. We have to exclude treatable conditions, the thyroid conditions, a stroke, vascular problems, et cetera, like I mentioned earlier in one of those slides. The more important conversation, I think, for that, let's say, a 70-year-old person is if I do the testing such as ApoE and it were to be positive, it's another piece of information that, A, might make it more probable, but it doesn't make the diagnosis. And then it's more important, perhaps, for similar affected siblings, cousins, and children to take the information from genetic testing and make their personal choice based upon it. Now, the ringer is, what do you do when you're 45 years old and mom or dad, let's say, are affected by a condition that appears to be made the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease? Should I be tested? And again, that's a tough question. It's a very personal question between that individual, their family, and their personal physician of what they want to do to be tested or not. What I would submit to you, which I presented through this conversation, is that it's an alternative that should be considered, and it is available. And if you want to know information about your risk of cancer screening or heart disease, to not want to know about neurologic diseases, it doesn't make total sense to me, even though I do differentiate a little bit because there may be less you can do about it. And again, don't take my word for it, because the studies done by people like Dr. Green, reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the results are people who've done direct-to-consumer testing, albeit a biased population a little bit, these people do want to know. So certainly there's a population of people who want to know that. On the other hand, there's a lot of people who don't want to know their risk of Alzheimer's, and these people may not also want to know their risk of having ovarian cancer, and may not want to know their risk of having a whole host of conditions, colon cancer. We fight to get patients to have colonoscopy. So if everyone over 50 had colonoscopy, probably there'd be almost no colon cancer diagnosed at late condition, yet many people don't want to know if they're going to have that or not and don't have colonoscopy. Well, that person probably is not going to want to know their risk of Alzheimer's disease as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of one of the things that you said before, too, was that, let's say, tomorrow or, shortly in the next little while, there comes some information along that says, either if you start this particular medication early, you can delay the onset of Alzheimer's, or maybe there'll be a cure or something to prevent it ever happening, entirely. So if you are... Well,
there's no doubt. There's no doubt earlier therapy is already conclusively shown to have these modulators, Alzheimer's disease, have their best effect. You cannot have someone with highly advanced Alzheimer's disease begin Aricept, Namenda, or Exelon, or the other products on the market. They're not going to have the same impact as they would, Dawn, earlier on in the progression of this disease. So without a doubt, it's valuable for that purpose alone.
Yeah, so there's some saying, a stitch in time saves 9 or something. Like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think.
Absolutely.
So all
I agree with that.
could also be reasons. Yeah. Okay, so here's another question for you. I think you've really answered this one quite well, but in case there's anything else you want to say, I'll ask you this question. Do patients really want to know their potential risk of Alzheimer's, they're having Alzheimer's?
So again, number one, working in the world of genetics, people come to me, want to know, because that's why they come to me to a certain extent. But as I said, hopefully clearly through this conversation, it's a much higher population than one would think would do want to know this information. It's almost like your first knee-jerk response, oh, I don't want to know that. And then you start reading more about it and hearing more about it, and also knowing this is not a test for Alzheimer's disease, let's say ApoE4. It's a test that suggests higher risk, higher probability. And we do that with so many tests and so many conditions in healthcare nowadays, from bone density testing to colonoscopies to pap smears, et cetera, et cetera. So it's another piece of that puzzle that people can use. But again, everyone has their own personal approach to healthcare. My goal as a physician, firstly as a family physician, a primary care physician, but secondly who does genetics, that people should have information and make judgments based upon that. So information is a powerful thing that you can use, and so when you hear you have a risk of heart disease, just knowing your dad had a heart attack means you're at risk of heart disease. It doesn't mean you don't live your life and never have a steak and never have a drink and never do other things. It means you modulate that risk. You alter that risk a little bit. And there isn't any doubt in my mind there is some risk modulation you can have for neurologic conditions like this as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So I'll just remind everyone that if there's any other questions, to put them up in the chat box. I have one more to ask you if I don't see any additional ones coming through. And I will also remind everyone that we have now put the survey up in the chat box. If you could just click on that link, you'll be taken directly to the survey, and just a few quick questions you can give us feedback on today's presentation. So if I don't get any further questions, here's the last question. It is, what are the future directions of genetics and genetic testing for this condition?
Okay, so what is the future direction for this? Well, first of all, as I said, in the last few weeks alone, there's been several relatively front page in the health areas, science areas of a good deal of research, money being poured into trying to elucidate genetic markers. Also prognostic markers. You know, again, it would be incredibly valuable if someone had a likelihood of having Alzheimer's based on genetics, and then we could say, well, they're likely to have a more significant progression, and someone else is looking to have a more mild disease, and that's being used in a host of other conditions relative to prostate, breast, or colon cancer. So I think there's a lot of research of, are there specific markers? What are those markers? Can we prognosticate or predict what the future consequences for this individual are? And then pharmacogenetics is a hugely important area to know which are the right medications for this individual. As I've stated, it's quite likely that early onset Alzheimer's and late onset are actually perhaps two entirely different conditions. And so the medications used for one versus the other may be entirely different. And right now, the physician community really doesn't have much of a good way to differentiate that. So I could see in the future that the research could focus in on, if you have this condition based on these findings, you go on this medication at this particular time, which is, you know, precision medicine. Whereas if you have that finding, that genetics, that abnormality, you go on that medication, and this is how you handle it that way with other lifestyle interventions, et cetera. So that's, I think, the real focus. But I guess, you know, the coup d'etat of this whole process, if someone were able to find everyone who has a certain finding on chromosome 19 with a certain pairing as such, seems to have the likelihood when associated with X, Y, and Z that they will have Alzheimer's disease. But I wish I could say it's possible to ever be the ability to be diagnostic specifically with genetics, and I don't know we're going to have that easily because it's a spectrum of conditions, Alzheimer's. So I don't think it'll be easy to have a specific gene test and say, aha, you have Alzheimer's at this moment, because it has so many multiple factorial elements, and the whole way the disease progresses is different from person to person. So that's a little bit of a limiting factor. But I think with the focus based upon millions and millions of Americans who will be diagnosed with this condition, I think it's incumbent upon the research community and practitioners in the field, particularly in the neurology area, to try to find the best answers to earlier on uncover the condition and prognosticate who will do well or not, and provide the right medications to institute therapy for these people, because it really makes a difference. You know, we shouldn't end this without being aware of the devastating effects of this condition on families. It is so hard to handle this condition. So there are support groups, et cetera, and they're there because when you watch a parent have Alzheimer's disease, it is really like their life is slowly almost being sucked out of them. So we need to find ways to really help that, both for the affected individuals and also for patients and families as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Arnold Pale, an expert in this field, and he's given us a very good comprehensive overview of where things are at today. And for those listening and for those who will listen in the future, we have recorded this presentation. It will go on our website, and we also will be sharing it with people in our database so that more and more people can become aware of this important information. So we'll shortly be sharing this with all of you so that you can share it with your colleagues and friends, and we can spread the word about all of us getting involved in learning more about this disease and the solutions for it. So again, thank you everyone for participating today. I would remind you again to take the survey, and again, thank you very much to Dr. Arnold Pale. We appreciate your excellent presentation today.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate being here with you. Thank you so much.